I am very excited to introduce you to Anya Marino, she, her. She serves as the National Women's Law Center's Director of LGBTQI Equality and drives the center's legal and policy efforts to protect and advance the rights of LGBTQI plus people. Before joining the National Women's Law Center, Anya instructed at Harvard Law School's LGBTQ plus advocacy clinic. She also served as the deputy legal director for the ACLU of Florida, overseeing department's voting right litigation and litigated LGBTQ plus and First Amendment right cases. She was the first openly transgender woman of color to serve in any senior legal position throughout the ACLU's federation, and was the first transgender woman of color to teach at Harvard Law School. So like not at all impressive background, right? Throughout her career, Anya's work has included representing the most marginalized and vulnerable members of the LGBTQ plus community. She got in 2022, the National Hispanic Medical Association honored her as a trailblazer, advancing LGBTQ plus health equality, and Liaison International honored her as one of 7 women who shattered, I love that, shattered the glass ceiling in higher education.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, Julie Womack, Julie Collins, and Red Wine and Blue for having me here this evening to discuss with you an important topic that is inclusive athletic programs for all women and girls. Once again, my name is Anya Marino. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of LGBTQI equality for the National Women's Law Center. It's always a little bit awkward when I hear an introduction involving myself, because then I have to kind of hear my history, but a few additional things about me. For those of you who are curious, I was born and raised in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where I lived until about the age of 18, and then moved to the DC, Maryland area, where I attended Johns Hopkins University for undergrad, and then went on to law school at the University of Maryland School of Law. Clerked for an appellate judge, and then worked in private practice for a few years before I decided, you know what, my efforts are best served on behalf of marginalized members of the community, without any who typically are unable to provide to resource out their own legal representation. So the Law Center, along with other social justice organizations, typically provide legal representation free of charge. So a little bit about the National Women's Law Center for those who are unfamiliar. The National Women's Law Center is a group of advocates, experts, and lawyers who fight for gender justice, taking on issues that are central to the lives of women and girls. We drive change in courts, in public policy, and society, especially for women facing multiple forms of discrimination. That includes, of course, women of color, LGBTQI plus identifying individuals, and other persons who are subject to income insecurity and housing issues. So I am, as a part of the LGBTQI equality program, actually housed in the National Women's Law Center's education team. And what that means is I'm part of a larger program that promotes safer schools for all students. Our primary areas of focus are survivors on sex-based harassment, girls of color and how they are disciplined, LGBTQI students. Ooh,
didn't mean to do that. Sorry about that.
No worries. Parenting and pregnant students as well. So let's talk about why safer schools are important. So research shows that students learn better performing on measures of academic achievement and are less likely to become disengaged with schools when they feel supported and affirmed in their school environments. Students learn better and are more engaged, and students are less likely to be disengaged from their learning environment when they feel supported in school. One of the things that we want to make sure is that in these supportive environments, students are able to actually learn, and that requires a good student-teacher relationship, because without that relationship, students are unable to trust their teachers and are unable to absorb information in the classroom. Students who do not conform to white-centric gender stereotypes of femininity and masculinity are more likely to encounter barriers that prevent them from completing their education. The sad reality. And we see this arise in multiple areas in educational practices in the form of exclusionary school discipline, where discipline policies and dress codes rooted in racist and sexist stereotypes that disproportionately harm girls of color, and schools hardening, such as hiring school police officers that prioritize criminal overcare. Sex-based harassment continues to be a pervasive issue in schools, while schools continue mishandled retaliation reports of sexual harassment and assault in school. Discrimination against LGBTQI students, which is the primary focus of this discussion, is something that we've seen a nationwide wave of legislation. And so learning environments that do not affirm their identities and actively exclude them from educational opportunities are problematic, of course, and discipline. And oftentimes LGBTQI students are disciplined for not adhering to dress codes created based on gender-based stereotypes. And then, of course, pregnant and parenting students also encounter significant challenges in school because they lack support or accommodations for them when needed. I also wanted to ground this conversation a bit in how typically when we talk about students, no sociocultural, racial, or ethnic group is monolithic, right? We each have our own complexities and each of us have intersecting identities. So I wanted to raise the issue of intersectionality up real briefly. So intersectionality is a lens for acknowledging how each person, may hold many identities and examining how these identities shape the various forms of bias a person may experience. When we talk about creating safe and affirming spaces for all students, we have to discuss intersectionality. And that's because we all live at the intersection of multiple identities and our experiences are impacted by them. And we are always out in the world as ourselves. So when we are talking about intersectionality in the educational context, we must be able to address issues that impact students because of who they are as a whole and not just because of one of their identities. Two examples of this would be Black girls who receive harsher discipline as a result of a combination of both sex and race based on stereotypes. Another example of this would be a deaf transgender student who's harassed because of their disability and their gender identity. So I wanted to provide a little bit more context and background regarding members of the LGBTQI community. So we will enter that slide deck now. So this discusses a day in the life of LGBTQI plus students. I think it's important to ground this conversation by acknowledging that LGBTQI students need only overhear the news media their parents watch, scroll through the clickbait content discussions pervading social media, or endure another instance of different treatment at home or at school to feel like their lives and identities remain the constant topic du jour. LGBTQI plus students' existence is unfairly at the center of a national social and political debate across all media platforms. In every state and local legislature, in most school board meetings, in federal congressional hearings, and in many state and federal courts throughout the country. And 85% of LGBTQI youth report paying attention to media reports and information regarding the LGBTQI community. So it's no wonder that existing data underscores that anti-LGBTQI private and government conduct contributes to LGBTQI youth's higher rates of isolation, risks of suicide, and the desire and need for mental health care, but the inability to access it. Indeed, approximately 1/3 of LGBTQI plus youth report their mental health is poor most of the time because of anti-LGBTQI plus policies and legislation. And nearly 2/3 of LGBTQI youth report hearing about potential state and local laws banning people from discussing LGBTQI people at school made their mental health worse. So again, this just underscores the point that the issue that we're talking about right now, which is that LGBTQI youth feel unsafe in most places, including their schools. Last year, more than 565 anti-LGBTQ plus bills were introduced in state legislatures nationwide. The majority of them targeted youth. 357 bills involved LGBTQI plus youth in schools. 141 bills prohibit or restrict trans and non-binary youth from accessing all forms of gender-affirming care. 75 bills bar trans and non-binary students from athletic programs. And indeed, this year alone, since January, we've seen an introduction of approximately 400 anti-LGBTQI plus bills, again, primarily targeting trans and non-binary youth in educational environments. Overwhelmingly, 82% of LGBTQ plus youth feel unsafe in schools. 76% experience in-person verbal harassment. 20% experience sexual assault. 13% experience other forms of physical battery at schools. And unfortunately, school personnel fail to address LGBTQI plus students' needs. Indeed, 72% of LGBTQI plus students report hearing educators make negative remarks about another student's gender expression. 58% of LGBTQI plus students report hearing educators use homophobic language. And only 11% of LGBTQI students report their schools intervened. Additional statistics to keep in mind, and again, I understand that a lot of this information is really overwhelming. Approximately 2/5 of LGBTQI plus students report avoiding school bathrooms, locker rooms, and physical education classes because they felt unsafe. 78% of LGBTQI students reported avoiding extracurricular activities in school clubs because they felt unsafe. 32% of LGBTQI plus students reported being prohibited from dressing consistently with their affirmed sex or gender expression. 12% of LGBTQI students reported leaving schools because of the mistreatment and because it was so unbearable. And approximately 16, almost 17% of LGBTQI students reported changing schools because they felt so unsafe. So to also help us ground this conversation, I think it's important to discuss the historical discrimination LGBTQ plus people face. LGBTQI plus people have experienced disparate treatment, harassment, exclusion for generations. And one need not look too far back in LGBTQI plus history for overt examples of government-led persecution of community members. And one such example is the Lavender Scare of the 1950s, which resulted in the non-selection of approximately 1,700 applicants for federal employment, the discharge of approximately 4,380 people from the military, and the wrongful termination of 420 government employees because they were suspected homosexuals. Now, using the word homosexual at that time encompassed all members of the LGBTQI plus community. During the 1950s and 60s, the FBI and state and local police departments also kept lists of suspected LGBTQI plus people. The US Postal Service tracked addresses where LGBTQI plus material was mailed, and state and local law enforcement would raid and shut down bars catering to LGBTQI plus people. The bar's patrons were typically arrested, and local media would publish their names and oftentimes their photographs. On November 3rd, 1992, a more recent example, Colorado voters ratified Amendment 2 to the state's constitution, which prevented municipalities from enacting anti-discrimination laws to protect lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Amendment 2 was later stricken by the United States Supreme Court in Romer versus Evans because it expressly imposed inequality on LGBTQI plus people for no reason other than community hatred towards community members. But that has not stopped those in government from endeavoring to treat us differently. For example, in 2004, a lot of people say that that presidential election largely focused on marriage equality. Some may even say that George Bush's reelection was a referendum that opposed marriage equality, given how robustly the rights of LGBT people were debated during the election cycle. And in November 2008, California passed Proposition 8, which prohibited the recognition of marriages between same-sex couples. Many remember Proposition 8's eventual demise before the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and the demise of other state laws that prohibited marriage equality when the Supreme Court correctly decided Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015. Most of us also remember The Supreme Court correctly deciding Title VII's prohibition against sex discrimination contemplates a prohibition against discrimination because of sexual orientation or gender identity in Bostock versus Clayton County in 2020. But the struggle for LGBTQI equality continues. So LGBTQ plus students experience persecution and discrimination throughout multiple environments and programs. And when we discuss the persecution and discrimination they encounter repeatedly, it's important to remember that LGBTQI plus discrimination and persecution comprises layers of complex sociocultural, multi-generational animus that is passed down and reinforced through interpersonal relationships, consists of multi-generational direct and vicarious trauma that community members share with one another. And the discrimination and persecution are systemic. Both have become deeply embedded in our social and government institutions, so much so that LGBTQI plus people and their allies often feel powerless to eliminate them from the system. So it's no wonder that studies continue to reveal alarming percentages of injuries against LGBTQI plus youth. For example, the Trevor Project's 2023 National Survey of LGBTQI youth ages 13 to 24 revealed 41% of LGBTQI plus youth people seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. 14% of LGBTQ plus youth attempted suicide in the last year. 48% of trans feminine youth considered suicide in the past year, and 16% attempted. 56% of trans masculine youth considered attempting suicide, and 23% attempted. 48% of non-binary youth considered suicide, and 17% attempted. 67% of LGBTQI youth reported experiencing symptoms of anxiety, and 54% report experiencing symptoms of depression. 56% of LGBTQI plus youth want access to mental health care and treatment, but they can't receive it. 47% of LGBTQI youth report being afraid to talk about their mental health concerns with someone, and 41% of LGBTQI youth report being afraid of or not wanting to seek their parent or caregiver's permission to obtain mental health services. Indeed, fewer than 40% of LGBTQI youth found their homes to be affirming environments. So, given all of that heavy context, we're going to start talking about trans, non-binary, intersex people's access to inclusive athletic programs. Next slide, please. So I want to ground this conversation first in why athletic programs matter. Sports are more than just a game, and sports participation is more than just about winning, as much as all of us, I'm sure, enjoy winning. I'm certainly competitive, and Lord knows I enjoy winning. But sports educational programs provide all participants significant benefits that include enhancing students' physical health and emotional and psychological well-being, providing students with a supportive network of social connectedness through positive peer relationships and acceptance, improving academic outcomes and educational prospects. And it enables children to find role models, build healthy relationships, and learn values like teamwork, leadership, sportsmanship, and discipline. So it's clear that school sporting programs have significant educational benefits for all students. And participating in sports can provide trans students with a supportive social network that minimizes feeling of difference and isolation. It can also provide a safe space for trans students to build confidence and a positive self-image to learn to manage stressful life events and to regulate emotions. Next slide, please. So a bit more about why inclusive athletic programs matter. The benefits from playing on team sports with other women and girls are particularly important to women and girls who are trans. Excluding women and girls who are trans from sports creates additional health and safety risks for vulnerable populations of women and girls who already face significant discrimination. Inclusive athletic opportunities provide women and girls who are trans much needed school belonging, community connectedness, and self-esteem, and it mitigates health risks they disproportionately face. Creating safe and supportive school environments, including through sports, promotes academic success, reduces emotional distress into adulthood. This can be essential for women and girls who are transgender because they are more likely to be bullied at school and to lack familial support. That should say familial and not familiar. My apologies. Social and medical support that if I want to also just harp on this for one moment, and that is that social and medical support that affirms one's gender is the single best evidence of best intervention for people who experience gender dysphoria. And indeed, some courts have acknowledged that forcing one's participation in teams that contradict one's affirmed sex has been found to both be dangerous and unethical. Inclusive policies are crucial both in athletics and generally to address the alarming disparities children and adolescents who are trans endure regularly. Next slide, please. So I think it's also important to highlight why exclusionary athletic policies are so dangerous. Exclusionary policies that target women and girls who are trans threaten all women and girls who do not conform to gender and racial stereotypes. Enforcing exclusionary policies relies on illegal and harmful policing of all women's and girls' bodies, appearances, and gender expressions. Implicit in these exclusionary policies are intrusive and humiliating sex verification processes, which lead to arbitrary reinforcement of sexist notions of femininity that harm all women. So what does a sex verification test look like? Well, it can involve physical examination of a woman or girl's body, chromosome testing, hormone testing, and menstrual confirmation dates. Any girl who appears too strong, fast, agile, or talented in her sport, in other words, girls who fall outside the traditional norms of white femininity, risk having their gender challenged for not being a real girl. Stereotyping is particularly harmful to Black and Brown cisgender and intersex women and girls who are often cast as overtly strong or manly, who are perceived as less feminine than gender stereotypes prescribe. So for example, when T.J. Pickett and Louise Stokes became the first Black women to represent the U.S. in the 1936 Olympics, an official proposed that the IOC should create a special category for competition for Pickett and Stokes, the unfairly advantaged hermaphrodites who regularly defeated normal women, at least according to that official. International athletic bodies forced Sadie Sajurian and Duty Chand of India and Caster Semenya of South Africa to undergo humiliating sex verification testing because competitors and coaches saw their bodies as suspiciously masculine. Indeed, Time magazine ran an article, "Could this women's world champ really be a man?" And an Australian newspaper labeled Semenya a hermaphrodite. Semenya was also subjected to invasive testing to assess whether she would be allowed to compete. She reported feeling targeted and crucified by the scrutiny, which destroyed her both mentally and physically. So this is just a continuation of why these exclusionary programs are so dangerous. Exclusionary athletic policies, like other policies that exclude and vilify women and girls who are trans, incite violence against all women and girls. For example, just this year, a teenage cisgender girl and her family in Utah faced threats to physical safety after a state school board member appeared to raise questions about the girl's gender on social media. The cisgender girl's gender was called into question because she crops her hair short, wears baggy clothing, and has an athletic build from training in the gym. On June 30th, 2023, a 67-year-old Richmond, Indiana man slaughtered 59-year-old Michelle Dion Peacock while she was speaking with her neighbor, believing Miss Peacock was a Black trans woman. On July 28th, 2023, A Staten Island, New York deli worker maced and dragged Jasmine Adams out of the storefront by her hair, believing she was a Black trans woman. In spring of 2023, a cisgender woman was accosted by another bathroom occupant at a Las Vegas casino, because she had a buzz cut. That other occupant believed she was a trans woman. And in Danbury, Connecticut, Amy Toms was threatened while using a Walmart restroom shortly after she donated her hair to cancer patients. So we've talked about some of the reasons why inclusive programs are important and why they matter. We've also talked about why exclusionary programs are dangerous for all women and girls. I think it's important to also discuss what Title IX actually does. So Title IX permits schools to have sex-separated sports, but it doesn't require sex-separated sports. It permits them in instances where the selection of such teams is based on competitive, it should say skill, my apologies, or the activity is a contact sport. Those regulations made clear the purpose of separate gender teams was to foster equitable participation of all women and girls in school sports because they'd been systematically denied opportunities. Ensure all women and girls had the resources and opportunities to develop their athleticism given the historical and ongoing denial of opportunities for women and girls in educational programs. And Title IX's broad mandate ensures all students, no matter their gender, have equal access to benefits and opportunities of school activities like sports. But before Title IX, all women and girls were denied opportunities to play sports, denied equal training and support, denied the ability to develop their talent, and all based on the assumption that men and boys were categorically superior and naturally inclined towards physical activity and competition in a way that girls and women were not. It's like the justification used for women-only discussion groups. There was a concern that when men and women play together, sometimes men would hog the playing field or refuse to play or compete with women, whether they were even on the same team. Additionally, men and boys were known to create negative experiences for women and girls who wanted to participate in athletics, and that would frequently suppress their interest in sports. So let's actually talk about the real inequities that exist in women's sports today, because it's not inclusive programs. The real inequities in sports, despite Title IX's promise of proverbially evening the playing field, is that 1.3 million fewer team sports are open to high school girls compared to high school boys. Division I schools spend approximately $1 on women and girl athletes for every $2 they spend on men and boy athletes. Sexual harassment and assault by coaches and trainers and physicians continues. And racist disparities mean that there are even fewer opportunities for girls of color who want to play sports compared to both boys of color and white girls. In fact, did you know when it comes to sexual harassment and assault, that approximately 93% of student athlete survivors never report they experience sexual assault or harassment due to fear of reprisal at their school and for the mismanagement of those claims. So I think this underscores a many reason why really the nationwide wave that we're seeing attacking women and girls who are trans ability to participate in sports is really a distraction from the actual inequities that exist in sports. And it completely ignores the dangers that it creates for all women. I want to open it up at this point to Q&A.
What are some things that folks can do to, combat some of this? I mean, obviously we, need to really get with our, legislators and let them know that we don't like this, but what are some other things that we can do to be supportive of these young ladies?
So I think one of the things that you can do is, of course, if there are, because we see these bans that are essentially rising up, not only at the state level, but also at the local government level.
Mm-hmm.
And if you see these policies are proposed at the local government level, I would encourage anyone who opposes them to go and to speak in opposition to these policies. It's also important for you to apprise yourself of certain politicians' voting records or officials' positions on certain policies if they're an elected official. And if you disagree with those policies, then of course you can bring your dissent to the voting box. And I always suggest doing that. That's something that I do myself, and voting is preservative of all rights. I think one of the other things to be mindful of is when we're having discussions about these exclusionary programs, oftentimes it centers on a narrative that conservative extremists use that try to commodify women and girls who are trans bodies instead of actually recognizing their humanity. And so it's really important to recenter the conversation on the vulnerable population's humanity.
Okay. And I totally agree with you about learning more about our different candidates from the local level all the way up. Are there some things that are being suggested to like national PTAs or to school board associations to kind of try to fight some of this?
Sure. So the National Women's Law Center works in conjunction with a number of other organizations, including GLSEN, the ACLU National LGBTQ and HIV Project, Lambda Legal, GLAD, and other organizations, in addition to what's called the Leadership Conference. And the Leadership Conference actually is an organization of educational entities that advance the rights of all children to have equitable and safe educational environments.
So, and I've been seeing this, and you touched on it some about the cisgender girls who are being subjected to some horrible, rhetoric, horrible, things, and even physical, in some cases, examinations. I don't understand why that's allowed. I don't understand why that's not considered like an abusive kind of thing, because we would not be, as regular people, we would not just be able to walk into a school and do that. So, I mean, I just really don't understand how this is happening. Why, and there's some immediate things we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen. So, what kind of measures are, folks who like have law degrees like yourself, what are we doing? What can we do?
So one of the things that I think is really important to emphasize here, because I agree with you, it's really alarming to see the use of these sex verification practices, and they run the gamut. As I noted, it can involve physical inspection of someone's genitals, up to looking at someone's chromosomal composition, their hormone levels, all different ways of trying to assess whether the person, whether the girl who wants to just simply play among her peers is a real girl, if you will. And what's frustrating is at no time in history of men's athletics have men ever been subject to the same level of scrutiny to determine or assess whether they are indeed real men. So this goes back to, I think, a central issue around policing women and girls' bodies. And it's part of a larger narrative to control women and girls' places in society and their ability to participate in and access opportunities and programs that they were historically foreclosed from accessing. And it's part of a movement to actually return to a time before Title IX. And a time before women were able to really manifest their own destinies and determine what they wanted to do for themselves. And so we're not only seeing this in athletics, we're seeing this in other areas, certainly in healthcare. And there is a lot of correlation between conservative extremist efforts to completely ban all access to reproductive healthcare and their efforts to ban all access to gender affirming healthcare.
Well, someone asked, they ask about advantages and disadvantages. Can you please dispel the myths about, trans women having an advantage over cisgender women in a sporting arena?
Sure. So although I don't typically like to engage in myth busting because I don't find it particularly helpful, and I would say that typically if you're discussing this issue with others, it's really important to bring them back to a high level versus getting into the nitty-gritty of fairness, privacy, and safety, which are typically the points that conservative extremists like to raise. And they're all debunked in a number of ways. So for example, the studies that conservative extremists use to argue that trans women and girls are more, I don't know, athletically predisposed to athletics or inherently superior to cisgender women and girls are actually not based on studies of trans women and girls' performance in athletics. It's actually based on a side-by-side comparison between cisgender men and cisgender women. So the actual studies that were used are flawed. And it's actually really hard to make an assessment of whether there would actually be any type of athletic superiority. And here's why. Women and girls come in all different shapes and sizes. Women and girls, some are more athletic than others, some are more muscular than others, some are taller than others, some are shorter than others. And there's so much variation amongst all of us that it's really hard to assess what advantage actually exists. And I would note that all cisgender women actually have some level of testosterone that
Yes, we do.
exists in their system. And indeed, and this is actually quite dangerous, some international athletic organizations are testing all women now to assess their levels of testosterone. And even in instances where there was a natural higher level of testosterone, they're requiring cisgender women to actually take some type of medication to decrease their natural hormone levels to permit them to participate in athletic programs. So this again underscores how dangerous and unsupported by science a lot of this is. And it really is in part because most of these arguments are based in sex stereotypes. The notion that men are predisposed to athletics, are stronger or faster. But the reality also is that sports measure different skills, right? Not all sports measure the same thing. Some sports measure mental acuity, some sports measure hand-eye coordination. I was going to say eye-hand, but you understood what I meant. Some sports measure agility. Some sports measure endurance. Some sports measure strength. And some sports measure speed. So it really depends on what type of sport you're talking about, who you're talking about. And it really also underscores that a one-size-fits-all exclusionary policy is not the best method to really engage in it is really not the best thing for children. And I also want to just stress, in most instances, we are talking about children when we're talking about Title IX. We're talking about athletic programs in educational environments where children are learning more than just simply to win. They're also learning how to be contributing members of society through social connectedness, again, through teamwork and through developing a real sense of self.
So why do you think that we're seeing this trend that we've been talking about of these increase in these bills that are suppressing the rights of transgender students? And what's causing this increase, do you think?
Well, it's part of a larger agenda that we discussed a little bit earlier, and that is the conservative extremists see trans students, trans people generally, as a clear example of their perception of the way that gender is supposed to manifest in gender stereotypes. And because trans people at least defy certain stereotypes, because trans people, anyone who is transgender, has a discordance between their affirmed sex, in other words, their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth, to anyone who's a conservative extremist, they're going to see that as a huge affront to their belief system and to the way that they believe that things should be ordered. And this is just one way in which they are trying to convince people to adopt and embrace certain sex stereotypes again, and to drive certain wedges between cis women and girls and women and girls who happen to be trans.
And am I wrong that this is all going one way? Because when they are talking about it, because we just had a bill, a lot about a bill here in Ohio, and I think it passed, but it didn't talk about transgender men. It just talked about transgender women. So is this all kind of sliding this one way?
So if the question is, are lawmakers really concerned about trans men's participation in sports or trans boys' participation in sports? The answer is typically no. And the reason is that most conservative extremists do not believe that men and boys who also happen to be trans are men and boys, much like they do not believe that women and girls who also happen to be trans are women and girls. And so they don't really see the inclusion of men and boys who are trans in boys' teams as an issue, whereas based on their notions of sex stereotypes, they do see an issue with women and girls who are trans participating in these programs. But I think it's also important to note that most cases that have addressed this issue have determined that these policies are indeed a violation of Title IX of the Education Amendments Act.
So why is the NWLC's role critical in this fight for inclusive policies?
So I'm really glad you asked that. I would say that our role is critical because we fight for gender justice. And one of the things that I think is really harmful is a reliance on gendered stereotypes. And so when you have such reliance on gender stereotypes, and it's such an affront to the ability of all women and girls to participate in programming, and potentially also incites violence against all women and girls, of course, the National Women's Law Center will have a voice in these issues.
So where can people find more information on this topic? And how would you suggest that they approach these conversations with friends and family who may have been exposed to disinformation?
So as far as finding more information on the topic, I would encourage viewers to go to the National Women's Law Center's website. Excuse me, it's a mouthful. And that is www.nwlc.org. There is a section on the website dedicated to LGBTQI equality. And you can view some of the work that my colleagues and I do at the Law Center that advances the right of women and girls to participate in inclusive athletic programs.
Okay. And then how would you suggest that folks approach the conversations with friends?
Thank you. There was a second part to the question.
Yeah.
So what I would say again is, I think it's really important to ground this in a discussion about the humanity of the vulnerable population that's being harmed. And again, to also identify how this harms all women and girls, because it does. And we see it from the way that attacks have been made against, and I raised one example of an athlete in Utah. There are actually two examples of student athletes in Utah since January who are both cisgender women and have had their genders called into question, one by a parent, another again by a school board member. And I think what's also really concerning is so much of these bills, so many of these policies and bills are essentially they're not only regressive, which I think, the presentation demonstrates, but they're also incredibly reductive to the way that we think about women and girls, right? Women and girls are far more than phenotypical characteristics that enabled a doctor to assign them as female at birth. the complexity of women and girls is beautiful. And it should be honored, and no one should be reduced simply to what a doctor identified them as birth.
Mhm. So how would you recommend us amplifying our voices to speak out in our communities, to speak out for gender expansive youth? What the public hears is very unequal, and that is actually, you know, affecting people because people are buying into this disinformation. So how would you recommend that we amplify the truth?
Well, one of the ways to amplify the truth, of course, is to engage with the work that the National Women's Law Center is doing. I'd encourage you to sign up for some of our email blasts that we do, particularly around the Title IX rule that has now moved from the Department of Education to the Office of Management and Budget for final review before release. And that rule would provide more clarity, and of course, guidance that is uniform across the United States, that Title IX, of course, does indeed recognize protections for women and girls who are trans, boys and men who are trans, non-binary students, and that sex is encompassing of gender identity and sexual orientation.
Let's see. Someone had asked the question about numbers, and you know, I kind of almost even hesitate to ask the question because I don't really know that whether we have 10 or 10,000, whether that matters. What matters is the treatment of the person, to me. So I mean, I don't know. I know that these percentages are very small. So, you know, but they're like a lot of other issues, there's being a lot made to do about things that aren't really even an issue or a problem.
Precisely. And so I think when we're talking about percentages of trans people generally, we're talking about an extremely small percent of the population. And then when you talk about dividing that even smaller, we're talking about 1% of the population that happens to be trans. Okay. And then when you think about those who want to engage in athletic programs, that number is even smaller, in part because, well, one, given the significant amount of disparity that exists, this disparate treatment and harassment that trans people face in schools and employment and everywhere. But second, again, the population is so small. And so what we've seen in actually some states is there was one student who may have wanted to participate in an athletics program, and that was enough for the state to trigger proposing a bill that would exclude, you know, this one student from participating in sports. And in some instances, it's actually a student who's trying to grow athletic programs. So a great example of that would actually be a girl who happens to be trans in Kentucky who wanted to build out, I believe it was either a field hockey or lacrosse team. And she petitioned the school to actually develop this program for her and her classmates. And upon the state legislature's identification of this happening, one of the things that they proposed that year was actually an exclusionary policy that would prohibit her from participating in an athletic program that she actually grew for the school.
That's awful. I would also think, maybe I'm wrong about this, but it's just like everybody else. Like, I'm the least athletic person you probably ever met. So I never tried to participate in any of it.
I'm pretty uncoordinated too, so you never know.
That was just really never my thing, you know, so I would assume that would, you know, follow, you know, just like with everyone else. Well, it looks like we are actually at time. I want to thank you so much for being here this evening and sharing this information with us. And, you know, being willing to answer questions too. That was very helpful. Julie, I'm going to kick it back to you to any last minute.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add to the conversation, if I could, was just we're talking about how do you talk to your friends and your neighbors and your family who may not understand these topics, besides trying to get them proper information and good resources. I think the other thing too is just to, people don't like government to waste their time. And I think what you guys were just talking about, I know in Ohio, we had Equality Ohio come and speak. And I know a couple of years ago, there was one transgender athlete in the entire state who wanted to play at varsity level. But our legislature was spending an inordinate amount of time to pass bills and not addressing the actual issues that our schools have, right? And so I think sometimes sharing that kind of information, because people are very confused. And I being number one as a parent to say, can you imagine the entire weight of the state of Ohio government coming down on your child? And then number two, just like, what a waste of time. This is what they're focusing on. So, and I think that's true, across the board in lots of states. So I think that's, an important point and things to kind of look up and share. So, but anyways, couldn't not share that information because I remember being very stunned by that and had a big impact on me. Anya, I appreciate your time. We really appreciate you being here and sharing all this information.
Ooh,
And
one additional point I wanted to raise, actually, as a good talking point. My apologies for interrupting.
You're fine.
But in essence, when these policies are passed and they do violate Title IX of the Education Amendments Act and also the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, states are actually at risk for losing their federal funding under Title IX. And so when these policies go into effect and they're enforced, bear in mind also that litigation will arise. And so the state will also be spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on defending a case that they will likely lose. And then after that, may lose their federal funding.
Very valid point. So yeah, those are, I think, besides knocking down disinformation, I think also sharing that perspective and things about that with people, and how much time government is wasting, how much money government is wasting with some of the bills and legislation they're trying to pass, would be very upsetting for people. So people don't like to see their taxpayer dollars wasted. So I, again, appreciate your time, Anya. Love having you here so much. Thank you. And Julie, as always, thank you for handling Q&A. Everybody have a really great rest of your week and we'll see you soon.